In an estate like this live many of the people that will be directly affected by the new slavery legislation. This is not a dilapidated or particularly violent and crime-ridden, drug-flooded place. People are generally decent but poor, with high percentage drawing some type of benefits and getting along with their life the best they can. Practically none of the inhabitants has come here out of choice, may have been steered to the place by necessity and need. It is often overlooked that the wealth of the few depend on the acceptance of less by the vast majority, and at the bottom of the pile one finds increasingly hopeless and less fortunate individuals. Not everybody can be intelligent or determined enough to succeed in life, and certainly everybody can be subject to misfortune and the vagaries of fate. For instance, in this estate, aging individuals find particularly hard to improve their lot. This is due partly by the accumulation of a lifetime of poor medical care and hard living conditions, and by the lack of skills due more to the poor employment quality than from the lack of education. The result is a combination of factors that virtually preclude their re-ingress in the labour market. In addition, and in contrast to what many people in more prosperous parts of the country, there are simply not enough jobs here to provide employment for everybody, and destitution prevents the vast majority seeking an elusive better life elsewhere. Poor folk are usually aware that worse is always a very real possibility. This is not meant that collectively they are a dead weight to society. Much of the improvements and rehabilitation from neglect and sometimes hellish living conditions that estates like this have gone through are often due to social involvement and efforts of those very same people. In any society, one will find pools of less fortunate people stuck to a place by contingency and lack of resources. This is particularly galling and evident in societies that divert enormous resources to keep privileged parts of society in wealth. Surviving here is incentive enough for anybody to try and improve their lot in any way they can. To put things in perspective, a cheap single meal would cost an unemployed between 10 to 15% of their real income. That is, the income one has left after paying for gas, electricity, telephone, transport, water rates, clothes replacement, simple medical care, and increasingly indispensable communication networking. Poverty is never about boredom, but about making ends meet and stress. This area of town is at walking distance from the previous estate, but it is a different world. Life is gentler, even if busier. Money engender money and gives a starting platform to progress in life. It could be the starting on the property ladder, or the entering in business, or the embarking in a worthwhile career. If one has a safety net to rely on, one can take risks and sometimes succeed, or at the very least hope to restart. Here there is hope, and people look at a more distant future than the next day or week. It is in a place where one can find ears open to new opportunities. Although it is not possible to enter, this is where the exciting new money-making opening in modern-day slave trade can be seen. These offices were empty until a short time ago. They are manned by 20-something work advisors with less lifespan than the work time experience of many of the people who are supposed to give advice to. Many are obnoxious youngsters with disproportionate amount of power to inflict real suffering on their charges. This is particularly hard on the older victims, obliged to attend worthless trainings. One can imagine, with a similar frame of mind, that of an old Jew summoned to the local Hitler Youth offices for evaluation, advice and help. One imagines where the pillory has been hidden. These are truly Mickey Mouse fronts, hurriedly created to fulfill the government contracts the Welfare Reform Act 2009 demands. So what are the practical consequences of the legislation and the flexible New Deal scheme it has brought into existence? The first one is that claimants will be taken away from any chance to find meaningful employment and shuffled for 6 months at a time to private providers, then made to work full-time, and one can only infer that the true aims of the law is that of reducing the welfare costs by offloading them onto privates. After all, the right combinations of state subsidies and the free labour provided could be profitable for an unscrupulous slave employer. The existing Mickey Mouse work training fronts would then stand a good chance of making money by acting as agency to find such slave employers. While most unemployed would not balk at the prospect of working even on minimum wage for the amount they receive in benefits, the prospects of many years of indentured, unpaid works, especially in the later years of their working life, is deeply unfair. Why then should people go along with this charade? The idea of coercion is imbued in the legislative with unreasonably severe sanctions, and the Act itself has even a specific section that deal with offences involving violence or harassment when the offender was on those premises for the purposes of a claim to a job seeker's allowance. For someone poor and without support, the loss of benefits can be fatal. The minimum penalty one can incur is on the say-so of any Mickey Mouse work training provider, or just because of a missing appointment, is 2 weeks suspension of the benefits. This means that in a cold winter, one can easily remain without heating, especially the many people that use pay-as-you-go metering. In most council flats, for instance, the central heating will not run if either electricity or gas is not present. Apart from the lack of hot water, living in a coal flat can be particularly hazardous for many older claimants with less than excellent health. This is no light matter, and anyone that has had the misfortune to experience this may know how serious it can be. Then there is the problem of finding food, which involves asking charities, queuing up at the local church if one is lucky. Any emergency at this point has no solution. This suffering is real, and there is no relationship between the often arbitrary ground on which penalties are administered and the distress and dangers they engender. If the victim is single and lives alone, the law does not provide any form of assistance. Yet even in this time of stress and penury, one is requested to be at the beck and call of its flexible New Deal providers on threat of endangering the vital housing benefits and therefore risking homelessness. This in winter, but probably at any other time of the year, would result in near certain death sentence. An end for someone that has maybe worked all of his or her life and has had the misfortune to find him or herself unemployed and alone at a later stage of life. The end will probably be brutal and degrading, as only those that have experienced homelessness can understand. The next two sanction stages call for a draconian 26 weeks suspension each, to be still carried out even if one time with the slave providers has finished. Most vulnerable people would not be able to cope, and there is no viable charitable infrastructure available to help. The only other penalty after this is a suspension from any benefits forever. One can see the temptation for future governments in need of cash of tightening the screw and reducing their expenses and give providers all the clout they need to force people into slavery, possibly in sweatshops and such like. Many people will be made utterly destitute and many more homeless. A percentage of them will die of it, and some in horrible ways. Out of this misery, modern-day slavers and government will profit, and a new underclass of alienated victims will be created. People that have lost everything and will live of expedience, ready to join any type of criminal enterprise to survive. This state of affairs will justify increased police powers and repressive legislation, and the possibility of a downward spiral in the civic quality of life, and maybe the ascendancy of extremist tendencies will become a real possibility. Is this what most people want and pay taxes for? What to bequeath their sons and daughters? Even if someone is lucky enough to have a job, wouldn't it turn back the clock to the days where one was scared of the consequences of, say, joining a trade union or fighting for better working conditions? The future is very dark, but doing nothing is not an option.